Black writing is a balm. It really is, at the times where I feel like I am at the end of my rope and I can't fathom what the world is supposed to look like moving forward for a Black person like me. I can read these books. I can look not only at the history of how much has been overcome and how much resilience is in my lineage and in my ancestry.
There are about 3,500 of those oral histories in a bound volume called The American Slave, a composite biography. I read every single one of those oral histories and outlined every reference for food. So the way that food was used as a method of power by slaveholders, but then the empowerment that African Americans had through food. It was just really interesting stuff. So I was like, oh man, gotta tell these stories because this is just stuff that people don't hear.
Stories. Stories are the threads that connect us to our past, weave into our present, and guide us towards our future. In the final episode of Season 2, I explore the ways in which the mighty pen is the most influential innovation of them all. Welcome to Season 2 of the Black Kitchen series, a mini-series that shines a light on the brilliant and Black innovators changing the face of food as we know it. The storytellers of today, many of whom will be the history makers of tomorrow. I'm Chef Jade Verette, aka Jade of all Jades, and I'll be your guide on this road trip across America as we go in search of the Black chefs, activists, distillers, farmers, and writers whose stories deserve to be told. For my last trip of this adventure, all I had to do was hop on the Q train and go 3 stops. I didn't even have to leave Brooklyn. The sun was shining, the trees were blooming, and my allergies were kicking. Spring was in the air. I was on my way to meet Chala June, a Black genderqueer chef and food writer whose passion is food and how it intersects with every walk of life.
Hi, Jade. How's it going?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Feeling blessed and highly favored.
I love that. That is one of a very Black introduction, actually. I love how we're always blessed and highly favored. Mm-hmm. We're going to talk about Black food writing this episode, and I want to talk to you about that specifically. Let's start with your influences in writing in general. Mm-hmm. How did you get into writing before you got into food writing?
My journey with writing started really young. It started in, I think, I'm going to say like a 4th grade English class. And it was the first time that we did a unit on poetry.
I knew it. I knew you. I knew you was in there, right?
It's always poetry. Yes, it was me learning about like haikus and sonnets. And I was like, why do I feel this way reading these words? I was always a big book nerd. I was that kid reading chapter books before they even started school because, you know, I was a little awkward. I was a little shy, and reading was the way for me to have a world of my own and really carve out my own space to explore and imagine.
So how did you get into food writing specifically, and then Black food writing?
How I got into food writing specifically was, I think it was my senior year of college. I went to school at Emerson College. I was in their writing, literature, and publishing program.
Okay.
And I was specifically focusing on magazine publishing. Magazines have been my entire life. And I was fortunate enough to take the one food-focused class that they offered. It was called Food and Globalization. And it blew my mind open. But it was something I didn't think I'd be able to make a career in. Mm-hmm. Actually, it was something I was specifically told by my father, like, that's not really a rational career choice. But also, he was a Congolese man. So it was doctor, lawyer, engineer.
Okay.
Which I was like, it may be a publishing degree. But being able to be in that class and read this incredible food writing that changed the way that I thought about the world. Mm-hmm. It gave me hope at a time where I needed it most. Mm-hmm. And that was the point where I was like, I want to dedicate my life to telling stories and finding stories and being in community with people who operate from this place of there's always something we can do to give back to this planet. And food being that big passion of mine, I knew that food was the lens through which I would be able to do that.
How did you get into starting to tell those stories and get your stories out there? Because it's not necessarily about getting your name out there, but it's about getting those stories told.
It was definitely tricky. I don't think I actually got to write for a food publication for another 2 or 3 years after that moment.
How did you continue to do your research in Black food writing, though? What were you doing along the way while you were getting that real world experience?
I was reading everything I could. That senior year when I had taken that food and globalization course, the next semester, I created my own syllabus for an independent study. I wanted to write a thesis paper on African diasporic foodways. And so, Pot Liquor Papers by John T. Edge was on there, and Jessica B. Harris's High on the Hog was on there. And I made this whole syllabus of these Black food books, vibration cooking. And I wasn't able to do that independent study, but I at least had this list and this syllabus to start with. And so I started just doing that work independently for myself instead of, for the thesis, for the grade. And I just have to say that for me, Black writing in general is a balm. And it is something that finds me when I feel like my back is against a wall. At the times where I feel like I am at the end of my rope and I can't fathom what the world is supposed to look like moving forward for a Black person like me, I can read these books. I can look not only at the history of how much has been overcome and how much resilience is in my lineage and in my ancestry, but also look at how these writers are positing solutions for the future and positing a world that we can work towards. And I moved a lot through my writing by the concept of Sankofa, looking backwards as you're flying forwards. And that is what...
very important.
Which is so important. And that is what makes Black writing and Black food writing so important to me, is it says, look at where we have come from and look at where we are headed.
Yes.
And look at how it's cyclical, and look at how it's a big circle, because what we're trying to move towards is really what we have come from. It's that autonomy, it's that celebration, it is that legacy of communal care and communal healing that we as Black people know has been inherent.
Because in what you're describing and what you love about that bomb in food writing is also what we feel about food as a people, is
Absolutely.
it not? Like you said, diasporic foods, how we have that foundation across the diaspora, no matter where we're from, whether it's South Carolina or the Congo. And I think that warmth is so beautiful, and it's indicative in your writing, right? You can tell how much you love it by the way that you write about food, and Black food specifically.
Because it's at the foundation of who I am, and at the foundation of just what gives me the energy to keep going and to stay alive. Like, I don't have to tell you or anyone that it is hard to be a Black person in this country and in this world. And we have to find those moments of sweetness and those pockets of joy, or at least just those pockets of not even necessarily joy, but recognition.
Yes.
And reflection.
Because it's not always joyful.
Because it's not always joyful. And that's the hard thing, because there can be, especially as more Black writers emerge and as Black culture moves its way further into the mainstream, there can be a lot of toxic positivity.
As we're talking about those moments that are not always joyful, let's talk about some of the challenges in Black food writing, because they do exist and we want to have a well-rounded conversation.
Absolutely.
So you have entered spaces that have not always had the most favorable responses when it comes to how they expose or don't expose Black food writers. And so I can imagine that you faced many challenges being a Black food writer in a predominantly white space. Can you talk to me a little bit more about that?
Yes. And I'm going to say that is an issue that exists across publishing and across media. As a whole, publishing is very white. yes, there are incredible Black writers who are pitching these stories and who are developing these recipes and who are writing these books, but they have white editors.
Yeah.
The publishing house is run by white people. The white editors are asking, could you explain this more? Or how can we make this more palatable for a wider audience?
Yep. Uh-huh.
And that is something that I see happen in my work day in and day out. And that's something that doesn't just come with, oh, well, how can we, because everyone wants to say, how can we, train and educate these people in these positions of power to be more informed and be more culturally accepting?
Y'all got to listen.
One, listen. Two, step down. Personally, I personally, and I know it's not a popular opinion, but I think that there are a lot of white people who are at the helm of organizations like this, of publications, who, if they are really committed to anti-racial work, they will recognize the privilege that they have, and they might take a back seat and be like, it is my job to then bring up someone or train up someone of color to a position that I am working at so that they can steward these stories. Because at the end of the day, if we're, pitching and creating and editing these incredible Black stories, but it has to go through a white editor, it has to go through a white lens.
It's going through a different filter.
And that is automatically, even if people aren't conscientious of it, that is a layer of whitewashing.
So with that, how do we preserve that culture and preserve those recipes, so to speak, when they have to go through so many different filters that sometimes strip away?
In general, I'm kind of Black-owned everything.
I root for everybody Black.
I'm rooting for everybody Black. And there are a lot of really incredible independent publications that are really pushing forward some great work by Black writers. There's While Entertaining magazine. There's For the Culture magazine from Clancy Miller. There's a really great one out of Baltimore called Palette that's like absolutely beautiful, and it's printed on newsprint.
I love that.
And it's like the colors and the design are gorgeous. Everything Steven Satterfield's doing with Whetstone Media, and now introducing their own talent agency as well to further get these Black stories and these stories of color out there in the food world. I think that it's happening because Black people are taking those reins and taking that agency.
Absolutely.
Because ultimately, if we still have to continue to go through these white channels, yes, they'll be engaged with those stories for the moment. And for me, having to go through those channels, there's always going to be a backseating of Black interests to the mainstream interests. Or there's going to be a commodification of those Black ideals, which is how the gentrification and the whitewashing comes in. The second you have to turn it into a palatable commodity for wider audiences, you're stripping it from what makes it an inherently Black thing, because it has to be palatable to the mainstream, which is still white dominated.
Yes, very much so. So what do you think the future of Black food writing looks like?
I think the future of Black food writing looks like more stories for us, by us. I'm big on the FUBU.
We should bring that back, right?
I feel like FUBU needs the renaissance. It's the renaissance we all really need right now. And there are, like I said, writers and publishers doing that. Bryant Terry's new cookbook imprint for Color Books. That makes me so excited because the second that Black people are able to tell our stories, our stories truthfully,
yes, very much so,
and holistically, is something that is so
and respectfully,
and not just respecting the person or the writer, but respecting the subject material and respecting the history and the legacy of it, the culture. And that's something that I think can only really exist in its fullness if it is from pitch to print stewarded by Black people.
Okay, you said pitch to print. So, and we know you're a long form writer. And
yes.
I mean, everybody's been listening to your eloquence all over this microphone. But how do you feel about short form content in the future of Black food?
I mean, there are a lot of incredible short form creators that are already doing that work. There's KJ Kearney doing Black Food Fridays, which I love his videos.
Very much so.
So much. And, Soul Food Scholar is another one that I follow. And there are these people who are really diligently doing that short form education, but also citing their sources. And that is a big thing for me. I am all for reaching people where they are at And so my main thing with that is just as long as people are speaking to the inspirations they're drawing from. Yes, we're creating the short form content, but then maybe we're saying, I'm talking about this because I'm bringing in from, Jessica B. Harris's book, or I'm bringing in from Michael Twitty's book. But being able to cite those sources and make those references out to the larger canon of work that already exists is so important, because with short form, yes, there are people who just want to scroll and go through, but there are also people who are like, that is so fascinating.
Absolutely.
I need to know more.
And it gives them a conduit to look into even more. Absolutely.
And it sparks that, that moment of, I didn't know this, but now this is opening up a whole world.
Let me go do my
research. So when the short form creators are already citing those sources, or they're saying, this is the inspiration I'm pulling from, it guides people and gives them a path for how they can dive deeper and refer back to what's already existing.
So you mentioned Sankofa. Can you go into a little bit more depth to the description of what Sankofa is for those who don't know?
Yes. So Sankofa is, I believe, a West African concept in origin that has really permeated the diaspora. And it is this concept to be looking back while moving forward. And it's symbolized by this beautiful bird that is kind of reaching back for an egg. And what that symbolizes is the bird is moving forward. It's moving forward through time and through space, but it is not only looking back, it's grabbing that egg from the past. It's grabbing that knowledge and that history and that information from the past. And not only just taking it, but it's an egg symbolizing like it is precious. It is something that is so precious and that needs to be protected and that needs to be nurtured as we are moving forward.
And what do you think is in that egg as it pertains specifically to Black food and Black food writing?
I think that egg is really just the ability to have this pride and this ownership in our own stories. Something that's really stuck out for me from pieces I've written in the past, I was fortunate enough to speak with Cheryl Day. When Treasury of Southern Baking came out, I got to interview her, and something that she said was, we are the creators of this cuisine, and I want Black people to feel proud about the fact that we have created this. And that was her speaking about Southern baking specifically, but there's so much about American cuisine that comes from us, that comes from Black people. And that egg, and specifically through the lens of writing, it is being able to take those stories that may not have been able to be told at the time. Because as we know, Black people not only weren't able to share their own stories, for a long time, Black people couldn't write their own stories. They weren't allowed to write. They weren't allowed to read. And people view that as something that is so, ancient history, so old. But my own grandfather, he was illiterate and he only had about a 3rd or 4th grade education.
Same, yeah.
And that's just 2 generations from me who is sitting here talking about food writing. And so I think that egg is really being able to go back and find those ancestral stories and uncover them and bring them into the light of day.
How do we, and especially as it pertains to Sankofa, how do we make those innovative then? How do we take those stories of the days of past that are still very present and then take them into the future and innovate them for our future generations?
I think Sankofa in and of itself is an innovation.
Very much so.
And so taking that knowledge from the past, taking that information, those stories, but pushing them forward through our own contemporary lenses, through our contemporary experiences, saying, yes, this is what was laid at the foundation, but this is how I am bringing it into the modern day. That is an innovation in and of itself. And being able, as Black people, to write Black stories is an innovation because of that history of not being able to. Because we're allowed to.
Proud to, right?
And we have the agency to, and we have the power to. And I think that Black literature in general is inherently revolutionary because so much was done to keep us from being able to write anything, let alone our own stories.
Yeah.
And so to be able to reclaim those stories and to bring them into a more modern context, even going back to talking about Cheryl Day, like what makes her book so beautiful is not only are they original recipes, but she went through the archives. She did her research.
That's the word I was looking for.
She did her research,
but archives.
She went through the archives.
Archive
absolutely.
Yep.
And that archival work is so crucial because otherwise we have no understanding of ourselves.
Very much so.
And we have no understanding of where we come from. So you're going to look at a young Black child who, you know, like me as a kid, is trying to find their way in the world, and they're being told all of these negative things about who they are and what they're able to do. If they're able to find that archival, you know, story of someone who looks like them, who was able to make it forward, that's going to give them hope that they never thought was possible. And that is why Black writing and Black food writing is so crucial, to be able to create that archive and that legacy, because literature's timeless.
Very much so.
Literature, I mean, we still teach Shakespeare, don't we?
Like, are we still reading things from these centuries ago?
And listen, I love Billy Shakes. Like,
I'm sorry.
I love him.
That's the new name.
Billy Shakes.
Billy Shakes.
I love Billy Shakes. 12th Night. Truly
I was
iconic.
in A Midsummer's Night Dream at
One
high
of
school.
I was too.
I was Queen Hippolyta.
Me too.
Well shown, moon. Truly, the moon shines with a good grace. Ah, Chala. What do you want people to feel when they read your words, especially, specifically, as it pertains to Black food?
Talking about feelings, I'm like, I have a Pisces moon.
I'm like, baby, because you are so colorful and flowery. So I want to know what you want people to feel when they read what you write.
I want people, specifically Black people, and specifically Black queer people, to feel seen. I want them to feel heard, because a lot of us can feel like we're just shouting into the void. And that's part of the reason I started writing, is because in my mind, I was like, nobody cares what I have to say. So I'm just going to write it down and keep it in a place and like keep it for me.
I'm so glad you got over that, Chala.
So what I want people to feel when they read my writing is to feel like they have landed at a place where it is okay to put your bags down, make yourself a little cup of tea, take a deep breath, and just like ease into this. Because even when I am presenting maybe my own opinions in a strong way, and I can be very opinionated.
No, not you.
Me, never. I still want people to feel like it is presented in a way where I'm not talking down to anyone. I'm not over-explaining. I'm not beating someone over the head with this lofty concept. And a writer that really inspires me to do that, whose example I will always follow, is Bell Hooks. Like, talk about feeling when you're reading.
That's all you're doing is feeling.
All you're doing is feeling. And it's because, yes, she writes about these incredibly like widespread universal concepts, but in a way that makes it so personal.
Absolutely.
In a way that moves through her personal experience and really just says, hey, if I could come to this conclusion through everything that I've gone through, you can make it there too. Here's how I made it.
Because it's very much a foundation of love, is it not? Which is what food is for us as well.
Exactly. And so that is what I want people to feel when they read my writing. I want them to feel seen. I want them to feel heard. I want them to feel loved.
And with the end of my conversation with Chala, so did my travels for this season, if only a train ride. But there was still one more interview to be had. We ended our season 2 where season 1 began.
I'm Adrian Miller, the soul food scholar who's dropping knowledge like hot biscuits. I'm a recovering attorney, former Politico and certified barbecue judge, and James Beard award-winning author who lives in Denver, Colorado.
I mean, how could we do an episode on Black food writing and not have the soul food scholar? All right, it's me and you.
Okay. Bring it.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I am sitting here with Season 1's host of the Black Kitchen series, the illustrious, the illuminating Adrian Miller. You ever been introduced like that?
I love that. I love that intro. That's better than walk-in music.
That's what I aim to give people. I want them to feel like I am their vocal walk-in music.
All right, that's cool. Mission accomplished.
You are, just a bundle of knowledge and a really hard person to follow behind. Very large shoes to fill. So I want to thank you very much for taking the time out to sit with me.
Oh, no, thanks for blessing me with that. And that was so much fun hosting the first season. So I'm just thrilled to get invited back.
Well, now we get to interview you and learn more about you, Adrian, and specifically around your food writing. So you've got some really awesome works out there. But before we get into them, I want to know, what made you get into food writing? What's your background as it pertains to food?
So the short answer is unemployment. That's what got me in there.
Real.
So, yeah.
Very real.
Yeah, I was finishing up a stint in the Clinton White House. And at that time of my life, I wanted to be one of the U.S. senators representing Colorado.
Wow.
So I was trying to get back to Colorado from Washington, D.C., but the internet bubble had burst and the job market was really slow.
Mm-hmm.
And I was watching a lot of daytime television. I'm not even going to tell you what shows.
Because I was about to ask. I was like, which one of the stories? Oh, y'all hear that? Adrian's a little messy. Okay.
Oh, it was so bad. Ricky Lake, Sally Jessica. I mean, all that stuff.
All the good stuff. It's all good.
Yeah. So in the depth of my depravity, I said, I should read something. So I was in the cookbook section of this bookstore,
mm-hmm.
and I saw this book on the history of Southern food called Southern Food at Home, on the Road, in History by a guy named John Edgerton. If you're interested in Southern food history, that is a seminal book to have.
Okay.
Wrote it in the late 80s. I'm reading it in 2001. And he wrote this one sentence: "The tribute to Black achievement in American cookery has yet to be written." So I was very intrigued by that. And, I'm reading it 14 years later. So I tracked him down on the internet and wrote him, "Mr. Edgerton, I really love your book. You wrote this one sentence. Do you still think this is true?" And he said, "Yeah, for the most part, nobody's taken on the full story. We have people that have written different aspects of it, but nobody's done the full story. And there's always room for another voice. So why not yours?" So that's what launched the journey.
So what was it that really made you pivot after seeing that particular excerpt?
Well, so even though Mr. Edgerton had said that, I still wanted to verify
mm-hmm.
that no one had written that, because I was shocked that nobody had done it. So I reached out to some senior African-American food writers, and they said, yeah, nobody's done it. This country's racist. You're not going to find that much. But cobble together the best book that you can. So I started getting on this newfangled thing called the internet, which a lot of these senior writers were not familiar with. And doing research on that, I got to tell you, I soon had enough information to write 5 books.
Wow.
But I think the thing that really pushed me towards it is I'm blessed to live in a community with a world-class library. And in the 1930s, as part of the Federal Writers Project, and this was something that President Franklin Roosevelt started to employ writers during the Great Depression, they took on this project to interview formerly enslaved people.
Mm-hmm.
And there are about 3,500 of those oral histories in a bound volume called The American Slave, a composite biography, edited by a guy named George Raywick in the 70s. And my library had the bound volumes. So I was like an amateur grad student. After work and on the weekends, I went to the library. I read every single one of those oral histories and outlined every reference for food.
Wow.
And hearing those stories, I got a much more complex view of slavery. Because, in school, we get a notion that it's bad, but we don't get a lot of details.
We get a sprinkling,
Yeah. So the way that food was used as a method of power by slaveholders,
mm-hmm.
The sadism that was practiced by the slave regime towards you really don't have a full appreciation for it until you hear these stories. But then the empowerment that African Americans had through food. The stories of people raising food out of their garden as an enslaved person, going to the nearby town, and then over time making enough money to buy their freedom,
mm-hmm.
Introducing things from Africa, given the harsh realities of the slave regime, figuring out ways to survive by taking the meager slave portions that they got through the week, but also gardening, fishing, farming, foraging, hunting. It was just really interesting stuff. So I was like, oh man, gotta tell these stories because this is just stuff that people don't hear.
And this is how you became a historian. This is how it was born. So who were some of your influences at the start of that?
Well, I would say the strongest influence is Jessica B. Harris. Her first kind of seminal book was The Welcome Table, a cookbook in the 1980s, I want to say 1984, which really was a mixture of history and culinary appreciation. And she's done so much to start illuminating the connections between West Africa and African heritage people in the Americas. So that was huge, looking at her work. And then the work of people like Lois Eric Eli, his book Smokestack Lightning, which was a book on, it wasn't just African Americans, but about barbecue, but it featured a lot of African Americans. And then I'm into humor. So the food writer Calvin Trillin, his compiled works was an influence. And then later there would be others like Tony Tipton Martin, others. And certainly there's Michael Twitty, who's doing a lot.
Big time connections. Big time fan. Yeah. So
it's interesting to see how many people are writing in this space now. Nicole Taylor, her work on Juneteenth, and Corsha Wilson. You've got a number of people now doing that, which wasn't the case, say, 15 years ago when I first started.
So let's go to your first works. Once you started getting into all of this research and really delving into what there was a lack of, what was your first piece that you started working on?
So the first thing was on a history of soul food. Now, mind you, when I started, because everybody was saying, like, there's not that much out there, you're going to barely be able to get enough to do a book. I was going to try to fulfill the charge that John Edgerton laid out about the comprehensive history of African-American cuisine. So initially the book was going to be a third about the cuisine, a third about the cooks, and a third about the culture that surrounded it. But after reading those 3,500 oral histories of formerly enslaved people, reading 500 cookbooks, half of them authored by African-Americans, only because I wanted to put African-American food traditions in a larger culinary context. So I was looking at all these other cookbooks, reading thousands of newspaper articles and magazine articles, talking to hundreds of people, and then eating my way through the country. So I went to 150 soul food restaurants in 35 cities in 15 states.
Oh, and how long?
Over the course of about a year and a half.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Yeah, it was spread out. So at that point, I said, okay, I've got so much stuff. There's no way I can do the grand work. So let me just write about soul food, because I think that's the most identifiable aspect of African-American cuisine.
Absolutely.
And so I thought, well, let me just write this, see how that lands, and then maybe that will be a springboard to other things. And the way that I wrote that book is I created a representative soul food meal, and I wrote a chapter about every part of the meal, and I explained what it is, how it gets on the soul food plate, and what it means for the culture. And then most of the chapters have recipes, traditional, health conscious, and fancy ones in case you want to show off as a cook. So let me just quickly go through the meal. And I'm part of the I'm part of the Black faith tradition. So if you want to say amen or snap your fingers or, preach that, brother, you can certainly do that.
I'm a big, I do a lot of moaning and agreeing.
Okay. So. You may grimace with one of the items and you'll know when I say it.
I will be honest. Continue.
Yeah. So entrees would be fried chicken, and then some kind of fried fish, usually catfish, although nowadays you're seeing more whiting and tilapia. And then chitlins.
Yeah,
I know. And then side dishes would be greens. In soul food, the most popular are collards, kale, mustard, turnip, cabbage. I often tell when I'm in front of audiences that are not predominantly Black, I tell them, hey, if you've been introduced to kale in the last 5 to 10 years, welcome to the party.
Welcome to the party. It's a trend now. Isn't that crazy? Isn't that crazy?
We've been eating them for about 300. And then you've got black eyed peas, candy jams, which are sweet potatoes, macaroni and cheese. And I wasn't going to include macaroni and cheese initially because I thought it was too universal. But so many of my Black friends threatened to slap me upside my head that I succumbed to peer pressure.
I'm your new friend, me being one of them, if you didn't include it, because it is a key part of the meal. You know what I'm saying? Imagine having all of that and there's no mac and cheese. What?
Yeah, you'd be like, what's with this? Then I wrote a chapter on cornbread, chapter on hot sauce, and then I wrote a chapter about red drink because I believe that red Kool-Aid is the official soul food drink.
Yeah, I think you're right.
There's a generational shift happening. There's a lot of youngins that like purple and blue. And as I wrote in my book, I do believe the children are our future, that we should teach them well and let them lead the way, but not on Kool-Aid because they're messing it up.
Well, I didn't know that the young people had gotten a hold of the Kool-Aid. I thought that they had been steered away from our glorious sweet drink. So I'm glad to know that history is repeating itself.
Yes, yes. But they have broadened it, right? So it's not just Kool-Aid anymore. It's a wide range of sports drinks and energy drinks. But the color, but the color is what kind of leads to that discussion.
Red drink. Keep going.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And then for dessert, I wrote about 4. So pound cake, peach cobbler, banana pudding, and sweet potato pie.
Okay.
So that's the meal.
Okay, keep going. So we got into soul food, and then your next writings.
So while writing the book on soul food, I came across the stories of a few African Americans who had cooked for our presidents. Mm-hmm. And, it wasn't enough to write a book. So I just thought, well, let me just delve more deeply into this and see how many stories I could find. And then I ended up finding 150 African Americans who have cooked for our presidents. So every president from George Washington to Joe Biden has had an African American cooking for them in some capacity.
Absolutely.
So I found a lot of those stories, and I'm just scratching the surface because a lot of this history is undocumented. Because there's a little bit of a veil of secrecy, around the inner workings of the White House, and unfortunately, in terms of the presidential libraries, it's very hit or miss in terms of whether they acknowledge the people that were working in the kitchen.
What's one of the most interesting pieces of information that you found in that particular research?
So there's really 2. One is, and this is a story that really captivates a lot of people, is the story of Hercules, who was an enslaved cook for George Washington, who, when he was purchased, because remember, Washington married up, and Martha Washington is the one who had all the enslaved people. She was a wealthy widow. He was purchased as a boat ferryman as a teenager, but for whatever reason, they transferred him to the kitchen. So he apprentices under an enslaved woman named Old Doll. And when Washington becomes president and is in Philadelphia, he brings Hercules to Philadelphia to be his cook. But there was one big problem for Washington in terms of Hercules and the other enslaved people working for him there. Pennsylvania had passed something called the Gradual Abolition Act of 1780, which meant if you were an enslaved person on Pennsylvania soil for 6 months or longer, you were automatically free.
Yep.
So what Washington did to get around this is right around the time the 6 months would toll, he would take all the enslaved people and take them out of state.
And bring them back. Mm-hmm.
And bring them back so the clock would start over.
That's so messed up.
Yep. But Hercules was well known in his time. People wrote about him in their diaries and loved his food. But towards the end of Washington's presidency, Hercules' son, Richmond, who was an assistant chef, gets caught with a satchel full of money. Washington believes this is going to fund an escape attempt, confronts Hercules, who denies it. Mm-hmm. But Washington's still very suspicious. So he sends Richmond and Hercules back to Mount Vernon, not to the kitchen, though. They are in the fields doing hard labor. Mm-hmm. So on Washington's 65th birthday, while all the birthday celebration stuff was being prepared, he successfully escapes. And what we know now is that Hercules made his way to New York City. He was a professional chef there at a restaurant. And he dies in 1812 of tuberculosis. And thanks to the dogged research of some amateur historians and others, they believe they've located his unmarked grave near Sarah Roosevelt Park in Lower East Side of Manhattan. If you will indulge me, there's one other person who's really fascinating.
I will indulge anything you want to tell me. Keep talking to me, Adrian.
Okay. There was a woman named Zephyr Wright who was the personal cook for Lyndon Baines Johnson and Lady Bird Johnson. When she gets hired, when Johnson is a senator, or in Congress, I should say, representative and senator, his rise in Congress was attributed to the dinners that he hosted with Zephyr cooking. Now, this is going to sound like science fiction today, but once upon a time, members of Congress would get together and socialize and become friends.
Stop
I know,
it.
Right? So a few people turned down an opportunity to have Zephyr's food. But when Johnson becomes president and he's lobbying for passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, he uses Zephyr Wright's Jim Crow experiences to marshal support for the bill.
Wow.
So the family lived in Central Texas, and they would drive through the segregated South to Washington. And along the way, Zephyr Wright couldn't go to the bathroom with the family, couldn't eat with the family. And so she just finally said, forget this. I am not going back and forth through the South anymore. I'm just going to stay in Washington full time. Mm-hmm. And so Johnson used those stories. And when he signs the bill, and when presidents sign bills, they use, 70 pens.
Right.
They do a 1 stroke or 2 strokes and then give the pen to somebody else. He gave her one of the pins and said, "You deserve this as much as anyone."
That is so fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And then, okay, so you would take this and you put this into your works. Next, we have Black Smoke, where you...
Yes.
Yes.
So 2004, I'm working on my soul food book, but then I'm watching the Food Network. And at that time, the Food Network was going whole hog, pun intended, on barbecue coverage.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm watching, and there's this commercial for Paula Deen's Southern Barbecue. And I said, you know what? I know I'm going to write about soul food, but I'm going to do barbecue at some point. Let me just see who she highlights, what the current trends are. Watch that show. Hour later, credits are rolling. Not one Black person was featured in that show. Mm-hmm. And I sat there and I thought, well, how's this happen? Because this does not square with my experience. And so then I started just looking at other TV shows and magazines, and it was just all about white dudes. And so I said, well, no, look, I need to correct the record and just show how meaningful African Americans have been to this food tradition that we love. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I wrote Black Smoke.
I love that you have pinpointed very specific things within our culture and our community when it pertains to food. And you've gone back. You went to the past. You did work that other people were not willing to do, that they didn't have the time to do. And I think that's really awesome. And like you said, there's been a blossoming coming forth of Black food writers and those who are highlighting us as a people and our contribution to the culinary world, which is everything, by the way. What excites you about the future of Black food writing when you see young ones coming up and following behind ones like yourself doing this work?
I just think one cool thing is there's a desire to illuminate the connections to West Africa. Mm-hmm. So building on the work that Jessica B. Harris has done, we're finding more people being experiential with that. So they're going to West Africa and doing an immersive experience with those cultures and their food, and they're telling those stories. And so we can start to see connections. And then I'm seeing it on the culinary side too, what I call diasporic dinners, where you have more and more chefs who are creating multi-course meals or, menus that reflect some West African heritage, may give a shout out to the Caribbean, mm-hmm. then their own experience in the South, either personally or through family, and then a more personal feel with their interpretations of some traditional and classic dishes. What I'm seeing in the vegan space, especially, I'm seeing a lot of creativity there. Mm-hmm. My only thing is I just hope people, as they go forward, will just do the work. And when connecting this, because we're at an age now where it's very easy to make up stuff.
Absolutely.
And put it out there, because a lot of people are not going to take the time to check, because, they're just trusting you as an authority, and they're just figuring you did your homework. And one thing that I think is a trend, I know a lot of people find it annoying, but in cookbooks now, you have these really long head notes that are kind of, that are shout out to kind of what's going on in blogging. Mm-hmm. But I have to tell you, as a researcher, those head notes are so important. And for those who don't know, the head notes are the introductory paragraph to a recipe that kind of gives you the backstory. Because I've just looked through so many old cookbooks with interesting recipes, and it just lists the recipe, maybe the name of the person who gave it, but you have no other context for that recipe. And that's the good stuff. That puts stuff in context and helps you get a really rich view of that culture at that time.
I was going to ask you how you maintained your integrity through Black food writing, especially with their with information, you either having to really, really dive deep into getting that information or not being accessible. So how have you been able to maintain that integrity in that?
So for me, it's with my work, I just show the receipts. And one of the things that people always say when they see my books, like, man, your bibliography is long as soon as your endnotes. Wow. And I said, yeah, because I know that I'm saying things that you've not heard before and you probably don't believe, because some of the myths about soul food die hard. Mm-hmm. And even when presented with evidence, some people still don't want to let go of their preconceived notions of our food traditions.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us a myth?
Okay, so like one myth is that soul food needs a warning label because it's inherently unhealthy. Mm-hmm. And it's a much more complex situation. And you kind of alluded to it earlier. So in my work, what I'm showing is that soul food is the celebration food of the South. Mm-hmm. And if you look at any culture's celebration food, it is not meant to be eaten on the regular. These things are meant to be eaten every once in a while. And if you actually look at what African Americans had eaten over time, it's very close to what we call vegan, especially during slavery.
Yes.
Because enslaved people did not have access to prestigious food items like white sugar, white flour, prestigious cuts of meat. Meat was something that was just used to season vegetable, and it was a sometimey thing.
To flavor up the pot of beans.
Right.
That was meant to stretch.
Yeah.
Exactly. All right. I have another question. You shared a bit of a note for those coming behind you, which was make sure that you are telling the truth. But for somebody else also coming behind you with food writing and Black food writing specifically, is there anything else that you would give them in their journey?
Well, I think this applies to anybody, but I always tell people, share your dream, because we are taught to keep things close to the vest because somebody might steal it. And look, that happens. Mm-hmm. But I got to tell you, a lot of wonderful things have happened for me because I told people I'm working on a book on soul food, or I'm working on a book on barbecue or presidential chefs. Incredible connections. People love to see someone pursuing their dream. They love it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so I've had a lot of good things happen for me. And yes, stuff gets stolen, but you just have to have the confidence that you're the one in this moment to tell that story, whatever that story is. You are the one to do it.
Yeah.
There's so much cool stuff that's waiting to be explored.
Absolutely. I mean, you see how Adrian got into his journey. He didn't even have a background in food. And you were able to obtain all of this information. And like you said, there's so much more out there and so much for us to learn about us as a people across the diaspora. So I think what you're doing and what so many Black food writers are doing is awesome. And I thank you. Thank you for your contribution, for sitting here and taking this time with me.
Oh, thank you.
It's a little bittersweet to be sending you the last postcard of the season, but here we go. Dear humans, I'm writing to you from my couch in Brooklyn, and I'm feeling so grounded, y'all. Not just after these conversations, but now that we've come to the end of this journey. Chala put it really well, that what we're moving towards is actually where we're coming from. What links all of our innovators from this season together is that each of them, in their own ways, are connecting to a greater tradition of Black people making a way for themselves in a world that doesn't want that. That's the Sankofa connection moving through each of them, and through us. For so long, Black people weren't allowed, were punished even, for reading and writing. Because the very idea of us knowing our history and being able to pass that knowledge down was threatening to the white folks in power. So today, now that we can tell and retell and spread our own stories, we must. It's what we owe to the ancestors who could not. In some ways, maybe the ultimate innovation here is the existence of projects like this that create the space for our stories to be told, heard, celebrated, and preserved. Okay, y'all, that's a wrap on the adventure of a lifetime. Thank you all for being here with me to experience it. Peace and blessings. XOXO. Jade of all Jades. In our final bonus episode of the season, I sat with the Davenport sisters, co-owners of Bem Books and More in Brooklyn, a bookstore that exclusively carries food literature of the African diaspora. How about that? Thank you to Chala June and Adrian Miller for these important and powerful conversations. To find out more about their work, please check out our show notes. Season 2 of the Black Kitchen series, Innovators, was created by Heinz and Whiten and Kennedy and produced by the Meta Creative Co. Follow us at Heinz BKI on Instagram, and while you're at it, please take a minute to rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and let us know what you think. More reviews help more people find us. Subscribe to the Black Kitchen Series podcast on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. I am the Jade of all Jades. Thanks for joining me, Pundu Road. I'll see you later.